Hi, welcome to session 3 of the 8th topic of the semester, Texas during crisis and reforms from 1890 to 1939. Now, in this session 3, we're going to look at the third crisis that Texas went through in this period of time that we're talking about, that is called the crisis of modernity. Societies that are modernizing, like Texas, for example, which is, of course, part of the United States. The United States is actually modernizing at this time, and other countries that are also modernizing, like in Western Europe, for example. Those countries that are modernizing, as they're transitioning into a whole new industrial economy and society, they're experiencing certain crises. Again, those are crises in the economy, there are political crises, and people are trying to organize to come together. There's specific social sectors of society that are becoming highly organized, politicized, because what they're attempting to do is really bring about reform, bring about change in the political and economic system, so their situation, their conditions can improve. And this whole new society that is arising can be, of course, reformed, can be improved in a way that it will allow not only those groups, but also all members of society to also have a chance, have an opportunity again to succeed. So again, we already covered two moments of crisis: the populist crisis of the late 19th century, and we also covered the progressive era, the crisis of the late 19th, early 20th century. And we look at that again, what actually led, those groups, whether they were farmers and workers or they were members of the middle class, to become organized and start to really create their own associations, their own clubs, their own organizations, that they really were trying to influence the political process, creating third parties, for example, trying to win elections, for the representatives of this third party that will represent the interest of the people, the interest of the working class, the interest of farmers, and so on, to bring about change. In other words, now that they were occupying a certain political position in the state of Texas, they were trying to use that position again to advance certain goals, certain policies that will attend the crisis again, taking place either in the countryside or in the cities, etc. And of course that also happened in the progressive era. And we covered quite extensively again those two crises and reforms. So in this third session, what we're going to do is now look at the third moment of crisis and reform that Texas is going to go through, which in this case, as I explained at the end of session 2, is going to look at the Great Depression. Okay, so this is perhaps the most severe crisis that Texas has gone through. It really that the United States had gone through. Actually, again, it was actually the crisis of the 1930s, the Great Depression. In which, in this moment, the capitalist system, capitalism, that is to say, which was actually the system that governed, if you will, all of the enterprises, all the economic activities of the United States, actually crashed in 1929, and for 10 years, capitalism was really paralyzed, so to speak. Again, it was really in a state of coma. So it's very important to look at, how Texas is going to deal, how Texas confronted the Depression. How did it affect Texas economically? Which specific sectors were affected? And what kind of policies were implemented during this time to help the peoples of Texas recover? What policies aim to provide relief on one hand, and on the other to also help the economy recover. That's exactly what we're going to see here. Now, before we get to that point, instead of just starting in 1929 and just taking for granted that we understand, again, the background, the historical background of the Great Depression. Again, I'm just going to spend a few minutes here just, outlining the main important factors that led to this crisis, okay, which is the crisis of capitalism, by the way. And it's not going to just affect the United States, it's also going to affect the world as a whole. The Great Economic Depression was a worldwide crisis, economic crisis. All right, so very quickly, again, I'll just spend a few minutes discussing the background. And it's important because otherwise we're not really going to understand, the policies of the 1930s in the United States or in Texas, and how and why the economy came to a halt as well. Okay, so it's important just to understand, why is it that capitalism came crashing in 1929, and which policies were implemented to help deal with the problems that led to the crisis. And of course, Texas is going to be a very good case study, again, for understanding how the states were dealing, again, with this crisis. All right, so let's start with number one. What we see is that one of the leading causes for this crisis in the capitalist order is that the American economy as a whole, in the opening years of the 1900s, it started really basing its growth, its development, okay, on the consumption of goods and services. Okay, in other words, the American economy was now transitioning. It was moving towards what is called a consumer economy. Okay, so what that meant is that, how economic scholars, policymakers, politicians, and the like are going to measure the growth of the economy every year is going to be largely based on the rate of consumption. Okay, if there's millions of people consuming products, again, the economy is growing. If consumption stagnates, the economy is not really growing very much, etc. Again, so the rate of consumption, the consumption of goods and services are going to determine, okay, the rate of growth, the rate of, let's say, employment, okay? If there's going to be jobs, for example, in the country, or there's going to be growing unemployment, for example, if wages are rising or stagnating or decreasing, all of that will be largely based, okay, not 100%, but it will be largely based, again, on the rate of consumption. So this is what is called a consumer economy, okay? So it's important that people are consuming, in other words, okay? So that's first and foremost. Again, that's what really, economic scholars, policymakers, etc., are very concerned with, in the opening years of the 20th century. So again, so we have to also understand what exactly were Americans buying during this time, or peoples in Texas were buying. In other words, okay, so what kind of consumer goods are coming into the scene that Americans are chasing, okay, that are going to be so fundamental. And those consumer goods, were really pretty much brand new. Those were actually innovated in the opening years of the 1900s, which led to perhaps the largest industries in the United States, the largest industries. So what that means is that it's not just that there's new products around that Americans are chasing. It's just that those products were manufactured by large companies that have many manufacturing plants, and they hire thousands of Americans for the production of those products, so thereby providing employment, okay, to thousands of Americans, providing wages, that is to say, and not only in the manufacturing of those products, but also in the marketing, in the distribution, in all of the operations that entail creating the product and distributing and selling the product. There were thousands of Americans, again, that were hired in those industries, perhaps, in a single industry, by the way. But there will be a multiplicity of different consumer products, each manufactured by different companies. And of course, we're going to see that millions and millions of Americans, again, are going to be hired in this type of consumer economy. Okay. So employment depended upon those businesses, those industries staying open, that is to say. Okay. So because they were the largest employers, in other words. Okay. So one of the first consumer goods, product, a mass consumer product, I should say, was the automobile. Again, the automobile came about, again, in the early years of the 1900s. The automobile industry was actually innovated by Henry Ford. He was the father of the automobile industry. And this is, again, a machine that was, needed, very much required for people living in cities. So what we see is that because there's more and more Americans, and even in Texas, there's more and more people in Texas moving to the cities, it was required to innovate a piece of technology that will allow the people living in those cities to move around. In other words, to be able to go to work, to go run errands and go grocery shopping and travel, etc. Because the railroad and the metro rail, which was very efficient, by the way, it was quite limited. There's only certain places you can go with the railroad, from this station to this other station, and that's pretty much it. But again, if people really want to take different routes and have to move into other places in which there's no nearby train stations, well, they'll have to walk. Okay. So the cities were growing. Territorially, geographically, they're gigantic. So it's not very practical to be walking around, the city. So again, Henry Ford is going to innovate the automobile. And the first automobile he innovated, which was really a machine, by the way, it was like a carriage that is not going to be pulled by horses, but by a motor. Okay. It's the same concept of a carriage. You can see here the Model T. If you just imagine two horses, in front of this car or automobile, it's like a carriage. Okay. So it was fantastic. There were, of course, a great achievement of engineering and science and technology and so on that put together this technology that was actually very needed, very much required for this new setting, again, which is the city living, if you will. And so therefore, this is going to be fantastic. Again, there will be millions of Americans that will be buying it again every year. By 1908, Henry Ford had already sold 15 million units, again, of the Model T. Okay, so we see the beginning, again, of a consumer product that gives rise to an industry. Again, it is the automobile industry, which hires, once again, thousands of Americans for the production of this automobile. And this is a consumer good. This is a consumer product that people are fascinated about. They're purchasing it and so on. So again, slowly but surely, the American economy is moving towards a consumer-based economy. Okay. And there's other, of course, consumer products as well, innovated around the same time, which were household appliances. Again, those were also machinery, but it's domestic machines that were also required. They were needed by the householders in this case, again, to carry out work that was previously done by hand, that took a long time. And so in the city, it was not very practical to spend most of your day washing clothes, for example. Okay, I mean, that's what exactly people needed to do. It was not very practical to always have to have some wood or coal nearby to heat up some water to take a hot bath, for example. and so on. So some new machines had to be innovated in order to make life easier at the household, you know. And so again, we see the rise of electric washing machines, water heaters, refrigerators. Again, this is something new. You now can preserve food. Um, Irons, vacuums, toasters, radios. They're now coming to the scene again, and they're going to be also, making life easier for people. Now you have more time, more free time. You're taking care of a household again. Now those machines can actually help you out, do most of the work that took you a long time to do before. So now this is going to kind of free, particularly those in charge of the household. The vast majority are women, by the way, that to free them to pursue other activities. In other words, to educate themselves, to take a correspondence course, etc., learn a new trade, and so on. Again, so it was also fascinating, by the way, to have that around. And once again, each product, was actually manufactured by different industries, by different companies. There were those that manufactured the washing machines or the toasters, the vacuums, and so on. And that also, again, led to massive employment as well. There were more and more Americans are working in those industries and the like. And so, again, the more that those industries are selling, the more that those industries are going to either increase the workforce, hire more people, or simply maintain the workforce and, maintain the wages as well. So again, there are millions of Americans going out to buy those household appliances every week and during the weekends. They're fascinated. They're trying to get a job, get some money, buy themselves a car, or buy a house, and be surrounded by comforts and so on, like those household appliances and the like. Again, people aspire and to live better, and of course, there were new technologies around. Again, that were making life easier for people. Now, one of the things, again, that we must learn is to understand, again, how this consumer economy is going to lead to the Great Depression is that the way that automobiles back then, the way that household appliances and many of the manufactured products that were innovated during this time, that people were buying on a massive scale, that they were made to last a long time, okay? So the idea is that, well, we need to really manufacture products of higher standards of quality. In other words, that was the idea back then. Look, because that is going to really speak, the quality of a product is going to speak about your company, about your ethic. Okay. So what you want is offer the customer something that will be durable. Okay. So the manufacturing, of those products entailed, really, not cutting corners. In other words, trying to really, manufacture the automobiles and everything else with highly durable products, steel, iron. They were heavy duty, tough built. They were made to last a long time. Okay. Unlike the products of today, for example, you buy something, it's not meant to last a long time because, well, if you want the economy to keep going, well, you have to make sure that people are constantly consuming. But if you're making those consumer products to last a long time, well, that's not going to help. Okay. Those industries make money and keep their employees, the workforce. So again, today we learned the lesson of the Great Depression is that, well, you need to really make something that is going to last perhaps a year, two, etc. And then people have to buy another one, a new one, because it will be useless by then. Some products you buy might be lasting even less than that, by the way. So that's the problem, is that as we see the rise of new industries, new products, people are rushing to the marketplace, to the retail stores, buying those products. And there will be the time will come again when people realized that they had purchased pretty much everything they needed, and there was no really no reason to buy any of those products anytime soon. So when that happened, again, the economy is going to start slowing down. So that will be the downside of basing your entire economy on consumerism or consumer products and the consumption of goods and services, is that at some point, if anything happens, for some reason, again, people stop consuming for any reason, for whatever the reason will be, then that would really drag your entire national economy to a halt, that is to say. And one of the factors that is going to actually cause that is that those products were made to last forever, so to speak, quote unquote, not really forever, but a long time. So by the late 1920s, again, most Americans had already bought everything they needed and even more. And so there's the problem of underconsumption. Again, underconsumption. People are not consuming at the same rate like in the early years of those industries in the 1900s, 1910s, for example. So that is going to be, of course, now dragging the national economy to a halt. When consumption came to a halt, economic growth also came to a halt. And not only to a halt, it started really, spiraling downward, as we'll see. Now, another aspect, very important, again, of the consumer economy that we're now seeing on the rise, the national consumer economy, is that this consumer economy was made possible through the introduction of what is called consumer credit. In other words, millions of Americans were not necessarily buying everything cash, okay, during this time. Because in many instances, wages were not sufficient, okay? So the way to actually acquire that refrigerator that you so much desired, because you needed to preserve food, for example, and so on, or that automobile, whatever, okay, was that, well, you might want to get some credit, in other words, it's consumer credit. And this is something that the retail stores, again, were actually offering, okay? There were no credit cards back then, by the way. That will come till the 1970s, 1980s, and beyond, the end of the 20th century. But in the early 20th century, there were no credit cards. And the way to get credit was go to a retail store, and the retail store will run an application, for example, just verify that you have employment. And once they verify that you were employed, that was sufficient. That was enough for the retail store to extend some credit. Again, well, you can take that, appliance, you can take some clothing, maybe, some perfumes, makeup, etc. What people actually needed, what a family required, shoes, etc. Doesn't matter. Okay. And so what we see is that because of the introduction of consumer credit, and this is coming particularly in the late 1910s, around 1919, beginning from that point into the 1920s, millions of Americans, really saw that as advantageous, that you can buy now and pay later. Okay, so you can actually engage in consumption and get everything on credit, and then later on pay it off. In other words, the economy was booming, as a matter of fact, and it was booming particularly in the 1920s, because after the end of the First World War ended in 1918. The economy went through a boom cycle. Okay, the United States actually emerges as a creditor nation. It had loaned monies to the Allies, to the French and to the British, fighting the war. And now the European powers, the victors that defeated the Germans, were now indebted to the United States. So the United States is emerging as a creditor nation, had a strong economy. Europeans were actually paying Americans again on loans. They borrowed, etc. And again, it has the strongest at that point in time. It had the strongest, the healthiest, I would just say, the healthiest economy. So for that reason, we see the introduction of credit, okay, in the United States. And Americans all over the country, of course in Texas as well, took advantage, if you will. That again, there's credit opportunities. The retail stores are allowing you to buy now, pay later, and so on. Again, particularly in the cities. Again, this is more pronounced in the large urban areas in cities. Again, the retail stores. Again, and so from 1919 to 1929, in that 10-year period, from 1919 to 1929, Americans actually borrowed, heavily in that year, in that decade, the 1920s. That the 1920s again really was the decade in which we're going to see the highest rate of consumption. The 1920s, without a doubt, in that decade, Americans on average, consume more products from industries, from shops, from companies, in the United States as a whole. More products in that decade were consumed by Americans than in all previous decades combined. Again, just on average, that is to say, the rate of consumption. In other words, the rate of consumption in the 1920s was the highest in American history. Again, but to explain that phenomenon, again, we have to understand that occurred, through credit. Okay, in 1919, Americans had borrowed only $100 million, for credit buying, and by 1929. This credit debt again had risen to $7 billion, billion with a B again. So yes, we do have a consumer economy, but we also have consumer credit, and there's consumer debt as well. Okay, along with it. So it is true, Americans are buying. It seems that there's an unprecedented affluence, unprecedented economic growth. This is on the surface what we see, but at the same time, Americans are growing more and more in debt, as well. And so that get us then to the stock market crash again. So now I'm not gonna really, spend a lot of time here, talking about how the stock market actually worked and everything that occurred here, except just the essentials. So the stock market is just, again, is what is called investment. Okay, investment. That is a system by which a company actually allows the public, anybody with money, anybody with capital, to actually invest in the company. Okay, so it might be the automobile industry, might be any of the appliance industry that I just mentioned. It can be it can be oil industry, it can be lumber, it can be, any type of industry, any type of company. So what they do is that, companies need investment. They would like to have people investing in the company. They can actually invest it in technology. They can expand their operations, hire more people, and so on, in order to improve the functioning of the company. And so what they do is that as soon as you buy, again, when you actually invest in a company, you're actually buying a share from the company. They actually sell you a share. You give them the money, and they're going to give you actually a share of the net worth of the company. In other words, you have become a shareholder. That is to say, you own a share of that company when you invest in a company. That is to say, so it's not just free money that you're giving it, but rather you're going to actually own a share, a portion, and depending on the investment, that you put into the company, this is, going to determine how much you're going to own from the company, how many shares, in other words, they're going to actually sell you. So again, this is something that, for the most part, the middle class, the investor class, is actually doing. When we talk about, for example, farmers or industrial workers in Texas, farmers and industrial workers are not participating in the stock market. Okay, this is very important. that when we talk about the stock market, is something that only people that have higher incomes, for example, that can be, again, a well-paid professional, a well-paid, executive, for example, of any company that earns a lot of money. They have that capital to actually invest it in industries, or small business owners and so on that have also wealth, etc. Those are the ones that are participating in the stock markets. Okay, so in Texas, the farmers, again, or the industrial working class are not going to participate in the stock market. So in that sense, we can say that when the Great Depression will come, Texas farmers are not going to be necessarily affected by the loss of stock, in other words, necessarily. But the stock market was actually fundamental to bring about the Great Depression. Again, because also what we're going to see is that in the United States now, we're going to see the beginning of the stock market in the United States. In 1919, we're going to see that the British transferred the headquarters of the stock market from London to New York, because the United States is a creditor nation, and so it's now the United States pretty much the center for commercial operations for the stock market worldwide, by the way. So Americans were now, because it's already here at home, the stock market, you can actually buy shares from a multiplicity of different companies. There's an option. Again, there's like an index, if you will, in which you can choose any of the companies that you want to invest, and you can buy shares, in other words. Okay. But the problem, here is that a great many Americans were buying stock on credit. That is, instead of actually saying, well, I do have money at hand, I have some savings that I would like to actually invest them in a company, what they were doing is that they were actually borrowing money so they can actually buy the shares. They can invest it in very, very promising enterprises that were growing every year. They were thinking that this is the way to get rich rather quickly. Okay. And so this is something that unfolded beginning in 1919. Millions of Americans are rushing to financial institutions, whether they were local banks in their cities or state banks, and different, at different levels, different financial institutions that were actually loaning money, to Americans in order to actually invest it in the stock market. It was considered to be a secure investment back then. In other words, look, the economy is booming. Okay. Those companies, in the stock market are very, very successful. There's no way they can actually go bankrupt. There's no way that the net worth of those companies is going to decrease. They're selling millions and millions of products every year. So if you invest in those companies, you're also going to receive the profits, because that's part of the bargain. When you hold a share, when you buy a share, they pay you a share as well of the profits that they make every year. Okay, they pay you, if you buy shares, it's not just that you're a shareholder, that they also share the profits, in other words, every year. So people say, this is great. So every year I can just be collecting monies, in other words, from those investments. I'll borrow money and I'll invest it in the stock market, and I'll be collecting money to pay back the loan. I'll be paid, every year a share of the profits of the company, and I'm going to pay back the loan rather quickly, and then I'm going to multiply my investment manifold. My stock is going to increase in value, So people are actually thinking that way. Of course, by 1929, 4 million Americans owned stock, which, by the way, I repeat, the farmers and the industrial working class, again, are not participating in this. Okay, so in Texas, again, those groups are not going to be very much affected by the stock, by the value of the stock that we're going to actually see here. Okay, the devaluation of the stock. Okay, so eventually, by 1929, the economy slows down for reasons I just explained. There's the issue of overproduction in agriculture. For example, there's the overproduction of crops. with the new technologies, now that farmers have seized the new technologies, tractors, and so on. And in Texas, for example, there's overproduction of cotton, for example, particularly cotton. So when you look at the macro economy all over the United States, the same process is unfolding. Is that there's just so much being produced. There's so much crop, so much grain, so much wheat, so much corn, even cattle. Again, even cattle ranchers in Texas are producing on such a massive scale, an unprecedented scale, because this is now the industrial age, in other words. So it's mass production. So all the industries in the United States are overproducing. Okay, you name anything that people are buying and it's being overproduced. Okay, because again, there's no management, there's no analysis. Simply, what people were doing, the producers are simply just producing in such a massive scale, and not really worrying about what would happen to the market if I reach a cap. In other words, look, there's gonna be a ceiling there, in which there's only so much that people can consume. There's only so much people can buy. There's only so much food people can eat. Okay. So if you're just concerned about mass production, let's say you're a cattle rancher, well, there's only so much beef people can eat. Okay. And corn as well, and cotton. There's just, again, so much people can consume, or in the case of cotton, there's just so much, people can actually process and actually sell, for example, clothing. Cotton is for clothing manufacturing. It's only so much clothing people can wear, in other words. So at some point, production is going to reach such a astronomical level, okay, in that the rate of consumption is not going to be on a par with the rate of production. Okay, so this led to what is called underconsumption. Underconsumption. That is to say, look, the rate of consumption of the past is not keeping up, and we're seeing now a drop. Again, the rate of consumption is now dropping, and it's dropping because there's so much being produced on one hand, but also keep in mind what I just said a moment ago is that the appliances and the automobiles, those new consumer products, again, are made to last a long time as well. Okay, so once Americans got a hold of all those new products, again, there's going to be a point that people are not, again, in need of a new toaster. Or, the refrigerators back then were meant to last a long time. Those were, massive structures, that were made to last a long time. So we see, as again, is what is called underconsumption. Okay, underconsumption. So what that led to then is that those industries, okay, most of the industries that were in the production of all those consumer goods had to downsize. Okay, it's called downsizing. Okay, so what is downsizing? Downsizing is that, look, we have to shrink our operations. All of our operations cannot be sustained because there's no profits coming in. I mean, our profits are decreasing every year. They're decreasing every month. Again, once we reach 1927, 1928, this is when, again, industries are beginning to notice underconsumption, and they're beginning to downsize. So what that meant, you have to lay people off, or okay, well, I cannot pay. I used to employ, let's say a single industry employed 8,000 workers. Well, I cannot pay all of them anymore, okay, because I'm not actually receiving monies, the way that I did in the past. So I have to cut expenses. In other words, certain departments are not needed, you close them, and so on. Again, you start downsizing, in other words, okay, shrinking, okay, the company to ways that you can actually sustain and keep working, keep operating again with a smaller workforce, that is to say. So that led to rising unemployment. Again, this is pervasive all over the country. It's pervasive in Texas as well. There's going to be rising unemployment. And finally, again, we see the great crash on October 29. Finally, the stock market came crashing just because a lot of those industries that had actually sold millions of shares. There's a multiplicity of different industries and companies that actually sold a lot of shares to investors. That is to say, they're now have to not only downsize in many cases, they have to even close their operations. They cannot keep going because, Americans are not buying anything anymore. And so as industries are losing profits, so every time a company is losing profits, the value of the stock of the company loses value as well. Okay. If the company is making money and is growing every year, the value of the stock goes up. If the company is not selling products and they're losing money, the value of the stock comes down. Okay. The value of the stock is directly linked, again, to the rate of sales, okay, and profits that a company makes, or every quarter, every 3 months. Okay, every 3 months they make an assessment whether we're growing or we're decreasing in value, etc. So there's companies that are saying, look, we cannot continue operating, and the stock that they sold to people is not worth anything anymore. Right. So more and more Americans are holding just paper in their hands. That stock used to be worth a lot of money in the past. It was very valuable, but now it's totally worthless. So when that happened, of course, the stock market crashed. In other words, the value of the stock came crashing, in a very significant way. Okay, because there's multiplicity of industries pretty much going bankrupt and closing their doors. And of course, the banks that had loaned people's money so they could actually, buy the stock are failing because there were millions of loans that the banks were issued to those investors so they can buy the stock. But now the stock is worthless, so they're not going to be able to pay it back. So they're failing, in 1929, 23, 100 banks failed. By 1933, 9,000 banks failed. Again, so it's a financial crisis as well, okay, with the stock market crash. $2.5 billion in savings were lost. Again, so people that had savings accounts in those banks, as those banks close their doors, they lost their savings. In other words, okay, there's nowhere to be found that bank, in that town, etc. $2.5 billion dollars, happening all over the country, happening in Texas, everywhere. Of course, we're going to talk about Texas in just a second here. The stock values lost $14 billion. In other words, stock that people were holding, those millions of Americans that had purchased stock, again, $14 billion was just evaporated. In other words, income fell 40% as well in the country. Really, the highest rate of unemployment during the 1930s was anywhere between 30 to 40% unemployment nationwide. Imagine. So again, this is staggering. It's unprecedented. It has never really happened, in the nation's history, or in any of the states, by the way. Nationwide, 12.5 plus million were unemployed. And 1 million were homeless, again, evicted from their homes. And, on top of that, of course, nature comes in and pretty much aggravates the depression during the 1930s, particularly from 1932 to 1940. We got extended periods of droughts affecting several states, particularly Texas, by the way. Texas was affected by certain calamities, again, natural calamities like extended droughts that pretty much made the production very, very difficult. There was no moisture in the soil, and the soil began to erode. There were large dust particles elevated into the atmosphere, producing massive dust storms, as they were called, or blizzards, black blizzards. Again, in Texas, particularly, again, it was called the Dust Bowl. Okay, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Colorado. Again, this is something that was witnessed in the 1930s. Those dust bowls. Again, it was so dry, in certain areas of Texas, the soil, because of the lack of rainfall, that we're going to see, of course, those particles now, the soil, the pulverized soil pretty much turn into a sandstorm, so to speak. Again, those black blizzards were reaching the East Coast. This is a photograph, actual photograph of the Dust Bowl in Texas. Again, this is something that was actually captured, something that Texans actually witnessed. That was part of the eerie atmosphere, again, of the 1930s, is that there's also nature coming in and aggravating, the problems, compounding the problems, because food production was difficult without technology, by the way. Okay, so if you didn't have any irrigation system, it's going to be very difficult to produce food. And of course, that led to problems like malnutrition and pneumonia. Okay, malnutrition and pneumonia. Now, people are actually malnourished. There's lung infections and so on. That, of course, affected many Texans, many Americans as a whole, again, because of the Dust Bowl. All right, so of course, Hoover comes in as president, President Hoover from 1928 to 32. He's witnessing the Great Crash. He didn't cause it. He's just there, in office when this happens. And of course, people wanted Hoover to be very proactive in the Great Depression, to do something. And Hoover is not going to be that proactive necessarily in terms of providing relief. He was proactive in terms of maybe providing some loans or monies to corporations and banks and so on. Yeah, but in terms of providing relief, Hoover was not really a firm believer, again, of actually intervening in the economy in that manner. Okay, like welfare or assistance, etc. Because he was a firm believer of what is called laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire economics, again, is capitalism. Again, is one of the doctrines, one of the principles of capitalism is called laissez-faire, in that under capitalism, if you abide by the doctrine very, very strictly, the firm believers of capitalism, again, believe in what is called non-intervention. That's what laissez-faire means, non-intervention, or hands-off, in other words, that the state doesn't get involved, again, in providing, for example, unemployment benefits or unemployment relief. Again, it says, well, if actually I give money, again, to people, because they're unemployed, that is going to affect their motivation, their commitment, their discipline, again, in trying to succeed on their own. Like he said, this is part of the American spirit, that Americans are very well known for being individualistic and self-reliant. Okay? That Americans have to do the work on their own, in other words, that we're hard workers. We don't depend on anybody. Okay? Individuals are responsible for their own problems, in other words. So if I help you, if I give you some money, in other words, you're not going to get to work. So you need to get to work, in other words. You need to succeed on your own merit. So he was a firm believer of that. So therefore, he's not going to be very much involved in providing relief. Now, of course, millions of people were evicted from their homes, and they began to pretty much crowd on the outskirts of cities. They're going to actually create, camps, like tents, in which they're trying to pretty much, protect themselves from the natural environment. And we can see that, again, all across the nation, Texas and Oklahoma, in other states, in that people are pretty much creating what is called their Hoovervilles, as they were called. Let me just scroll this, their Hoovervilles. Like a part of town in which all the homeless live now. They live there because people are unemployed, they're homeless, they were evicted from their houses, they lost their mortgages to a financial institution and so on. They lost their job and so on. So they're living outside, they're crowding again outside of the city. So this is, again, very, very important how, the landscape is looking like, again, as the Depression unfolds from 1929 onwards, when Hoover was in office, is, again, that the Americans are very desperate, that something needed to be done. Okay. In 1932, Hoover will lose the election to FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, the Democrat, by the way. FDR, Hoover was actually Republican. And FDR brings, of course, a new philosophy, again, to intervene in the economy, state intervention through what is called state spending. Okay, that the state can actually spend monies again in the economy in downturn, when there's an economic downturns again, for example, a recession or depression. So instead of allowing the economy to be in a recession or depression for a long time, that the state can lessen the effects again of those downturns by spending money. Okay, this is called Keynesian Economics. Again, it's a new philosophy that was in vogue in Europe. The British were pretty much moving towards what is called state spending, measures to deal with the depression. And it's called Keynesian Economics, in which the state is going to actually provide, of course, monies to hire people again to do work. So if private industries and companies are not hiring because they have gone bankrupt, etc., that the state can be an employer as well. The state can provide employment and wages to people to do something that is required, in society, to lessen the effects of those downturns that were so common in the business cycles. That this was part of the a bust, period of the business cycle, that the economies go through cycles. They have a boom cycle and they bust at some point. And so because we're now at that point, FDR said, we're in this downturn, that the state can come in to lessen the effects of the business cycle. In other words, to, lessen the effects, for example, of unemployment. That's something that, again, that we're going to see now in Texas. Now that we understand the background of what the country is going through, what Texas is going through as well, now it will be easier to understand how Texas is going to confront the crises. In other words, now we understand the crisis as a whole. Now let's look at reform, so to speak. Okay, in Texas, in the Great Depression, again, affected the agricultural sector in a very significant way. The agricultural economy declined sharply, 50%. So up to this point, still, the backbone of the Texas economy is still agriculture, cash crop agriculture. Despite the fact that it has industries, it has the lumber industry, the oil industry, and the like that are very, very productive, very profitable. Still, the agricultural sector is the strongest because this is where more people participate. Again, there's more farmers, let's say, than industrial workers, for example. Okay, so agricultural production again is what Texas is actually known for. It sustains the state, the operations of the state. The revenues of the state, the export, and so on, is mostly agricultural products, cattle ranching as well. And so the agricultural economy of Texas declined sharply, 50%, during the Great Depression. Farmers who had borrowed monies from financial institutions to modernize their techniques, buying, for example, machinery and tractors and so on, they defaulted. Again, on the loans, because the agricultural economy came down, agricultural prices came down. So therefore, they're not really receiving the same revenues that they were in the past. We have to understand that part of the reason why Texas is in this predicament is because of overproduction. Okay, Texas farmers were also just overproducing products like cotton, for example. Okay, so cotton prices came down, because there's so much cotton. On one hand, there's overproduction, and there's also underconsumption. The manufacturing industry that process cotton into clothing, for example, are not open. They're closing their operations or downsizing. So your clients, again, if you're a cotton producer, it's not buying this product. Again, so again, it actually led to this issue of overproduction and underconsumption, which affected the agricultural, again, economy of Texas, cotton prices, for example. Okay. In terms of industrial production, also industrial production was affected significantly, which led to massive unemployment. In the state of Texas, there were anywhere between 350,000 to 400,000 workers that, lost their job. Okay, because they were working for various types of industries that also had to downsize as well. And they had to shrink their operations. They let a lot of people go, by the way. And what we know is that one of the most affected groups, in Texas during the Great Depression, whether it was in the agricultural sector or in the industrial sector, okay, once again, we see the issue of farmers and workers being affected, those particular groups, despite the fact that they're not really affected by the value of the stock. In other words, they were not really losing money in stock value because they didn't buy any stock. But nonetheless, they depended upon agricultural production, the farmers, or, the industrial production, the consumer, again, of products that were working for industries that were producing products for consumption. Well, they lost their jobs. But what we know is that one of the groups that actually were mostly affected in Texas were minorities. Okay, minorities. This is not to say that only minorities were affected. Okay, but those were the first, for example, to be laid off. Okay, again, in whether we talk about, for example, in manufacturing or industries, again, companies that hire minorities, well, they were the first ones to be laid off, in other words. And this is, again, something that we have to understand as we see this massive unemployment. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that, and this is something that, Hoover, implemented before FDR came into office, okay, in 1932. President Hoover actually tried to address the Depression by, on one hand, pretty much assisting large industries in the United States because they were the largest employers in the country. So for them to remain open, he really provided loans and monies again to big businesses. That was one, of the measures. But the other, measure was to initiate a repatriation program for Mexicans. Okay, that was what President Hoover actually did. So, in other words, what Hoover said is that, well, one of the reasons, why it was difficult to get out of the Depression is because there was still a large segment of the population, particularly in the Southwest, from Texas to California again, who were actually, recently arrived, newly arrived immigrants. Okay. So again, so he initiated what is called the repatriation program, again, for Mexicans. In Texas, the population of Mexican Americans or people of Mexican descent, whether they have been here, several generations, heirs of descendants of peoples that came to Texas in many generations ago, or they were newly arrived immigrants. There were about 500,000, Mexicans, and out of that 500,000, 250,000, 250,000 were actually, repatriated, back to Mexico. Okay, in many cases, they were Mexicans or Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants that decided to actually go back to Mexico on their own. In other words, some of them actually understood that this was something that was pervasive. It was actually happening nationwide. It was just a matter of time, when they would have to actually leave the country and they pretty much decided to go to Mexico, by their own choice. Some of them, not all of them, but again, we're going to see that this is affecting, particularly in the state of Texas, minorities, because the one minority group, in this case, the Mexican Americans, are actually being sent back, to Mexico. Number three, there's of course African Americans that lived in the countryside. They were farmers. They were largely affected by the decline of agricultural prices, different products. So they had to migrate to the cities because they just, they're not going to find opportunities in the farm, in other words, okay? So they migrated to the cities because they heard that in the cities there were certain programs implemented there to provide relief, to provide some form of assistance or any type of employment. They will find anything, whatever kind of opportunity of any kind of employment will be welcome. So we're going to see a massive migration again of African Americans to the cities, again from the countryside to the cities. This is another shift we see here in the demographics. Now the cities of Texas are going to increase again diversity because there's again more and more African Americans arriving again to the cities in pursuit of some form of benefits or programs or jobs, opportunities, anything that will enable them to survive again in this crisis. Okay. Now, women, another minority group, are also going to undergo, a lot of what is called discrimination and sexism as well during the Great Depression, particularly because they were also laid off, from certain jobs that they carried out, because of sexism, that is to say. So the idea is that, the bias, back then was that it would be better to hire men or to keep males at the workplace because they were believed to be the providers of the household. In other words, the breadwinners, in other words. Like, look, it is the man that is supposed to be in charge of the economic well-being of the family. So if we have to choose who's going to go first, it's going to be women. Now they have to go back home, take care of the household, and so on. It was part of the discrimination and sexism, in other words, in which women were either laid off on one hand, or their wages being cut significantly just to stay at the workplace in many cases. Okay. So that, again, typical, mindset during this time, in the 1930s in Texas, by the way. Low pay was, common, and atrocious conditions as well at the workplace as well. They had to endure, once again, all of that, all of those conditions in this time of crisis. And in many cases, because it was a crisis, because there were no real choice, if you will, to, people can actually choose from a wide variety of different, companies or different employers. People had to pretty much, endure, those kinds of discriminations again, or sexism in this case. All right. So in Texas, what we see in the opening years of the 1930s is that Texas also shared certain ideological views with Hoover. Not that it was, Republican. Of course, Hoover is Republican in this case. But what I mean about ideological views is that this idea of individualism and self-reliance, for example, that Hoover was so much in favor of, that was the laissez-faire economics, in other words, the hands-off, non-intervention, the idea that the state had to provide relief directly to the population, that was not really consistent, in other words, with the spirit of capitalism, with the doctrine of capitalism, or with the cultural values of the time. That this is not, again, the way you help people prosper. When you help them, when you provide so much assistance, when you spend some money, again, in public services like welfare and so on, that this is not the way people are going to actually, work hard towards their own economic well-being. They're not going to be driven to succeed on their own, because they are going to grow dependent upon the state. So any kind of aid, this is disincentivize the people to actually pursue again any kind of work, because they pretty much grow dependent, in other words, from the state. For example, children, that are given everything, that they don't have to work at that. They're just given that because that creates the kind of spirit that leads them to become inactive, for example, that they're not going to move from their place because they're following what is called the path of least resistance. You feel comfortable in that place, in that situation in which something is just being given to you. That creates a comfort zone, and we don't want to actually change that, in other words. So that is, again, the mindset in the state of Texas, at least at the level of policymakers, the politicians, the main political parties actually think this way. So therefore, during the Great Depression, when Hoover was in office, what happened is that certain cities were trying to simply enact programs on their own that were not necessarily pushed for by the state. This is called voluntarism, in other words, volunteers. In other words, it is your own will. It is your own option to help people. Every city will have to actually volunteer to do something on their own that they're not required to do. This is just voluntary work, in other words, voluntary, okay? So every city in Texas was implementing different types of programs and approaches, again, to try to, help the population. For example, augmenting private charities. Cities will simply, again, try to use certain buildings, to provide, for example, shelter, or, call the population to create charities, for example, where people, donate monies and so on, so they can use those monies to feed people and so on. Again, this is like a grassroots type of organization coming from the people, that people are going to pretty much help each other through their own will, through their own effort, not because they have to, in other words, because there's a policy, coming from the state. Public works project as well. Certain cities actually said, well, we need to do certain, improvements in the city. Okay, we need to widen the streets. Oh, we need to, provide sewer or water lines, etc., to certain sections of the city that don't have those services and so on. So, we need to improve our parks, maybe build new ones or certain buildings and so on. So this is what the city needs to do anyway. So what we're going to do is actually just hire people, okay, to do that. Construction work. So people work for the city. But you're working, you're earning that money. In other words, the money is not being given to you, but rather you're actually doing something, to improve your society, and you're going to get paid. Again, that, provides employment. Okay, soup kitchens as well. There were soup kitchens that the cities were creating. They were using, again, public buildings for shelters, certain buildings that were not in use or abandoned, etc. They will simply seize that building and create a shelter to move people in that were homeless, by the way. Again, this is in Texas. There were what is called city austerity programs as well. Okay, so what is a city austerity programs?
Well, those programs, were just simply, once again, trying to shrink, the budget, trying to reduce the spending, what is called the deficit in many cases. How much money is the city's actually spending? Well, we have to downsize as well. Discharging certain city employees, for example, eliminating certain urban services. Some of them were eliminated because they were, creating an excess burden, excess, costs for the city. They were enacting what is called a salary or hiring freeze as well. And in some instances, like the city of Houston, for example, implemented what was called a cut-off street light. Street lights. It pretty much, it costs electricity. There's a light bill to be paid. That the city has to pay and so on. Well, we have to cut off again that public, that public facility again. The street lights. We have to cut it, in other words. Okay. And Beaumont and Houston, again, this is where those cities were actually doing that, trying to save electricity. Okay. And also cutting budgets for public education and libraries. In many cases, again, they said, oh, we're spending so much in education, in books, and, and having teachers and so on, or public libraries and so on. Well, who needs a library right now? Okay. So we're going to actually either close the library or, reduce, the workforce there, the people that work for the city library, for example. Now, the depression in Texas, again, hit in a very significant way, as I mentioned a moment ago, the agricultural sector. There was really an agricultural depression taking place in Texas. So we're going to see what actually occurred here, what kind of policies were implemented to help, Texas recover, okay, in the agricultural sector. Once again, farmers were unaffected by the stock market because they were not really in the stock market. They were mostly affected by agricultural prices, particularly the cotton, again, the price of cotton that plummeted 50% because of overproduction and falling prices. Again, it was a cotton-based economy. Still, cotton was king. Even up to this point in Texas, cotton was king. But again, we see that the price of cotton plummeted 50%. Okay, so there's a lot of farmers that were growing cotton, and again, they're defaulting on loans. They're not able to pay back any loans they obtained for investing in the farm. In many cases, they lose their farms and they become tenants farmers. In many cases, there's a new landowner now that seizes your own farm. Then people have to pay rent, to that new landowner. Now, in Texas, what we see is that the way Texas was trying to address this agricultural depression is by creating what it was called the Federal Farm Board in 1929, okay, to stabilize the price of cotton. Cotton Stabilization Corporation, okay. That was actually, again, what the Federal Farm Board actually did is that it created what is called a Cotton Stabilization Corporation. And what it was attempting to do was very similar to what farmers back in the populist era were attempting to do with the with this plan of withholding, okay, with the sub-treasury plan of withholding, building warehouses and withholding all of the cotton from the market. Not only cotton, but all the crops. In other words, we need to wait to create, again, scarcity in the market to allow for the prices to go up and start releasing the product, because we just flood the market with all this cotton. This cotton is going to be pretty much useless. It's going to be just floating around the economy, totally worthless. So we need to pretty much maintain the value by withholding it from the market. Okay. And also, this approach, this agency was trying to diversify crops, in Texas. That look, we rely so heavily on cotton agriculture. So what we need to do is pretty much diversify, try to move little by little away from cotton. Still, cotton will be important in Texas, but we need to grow other crops that are also very valuable, again, around the world, like food products and so on. And when it comes to cotton, we need to establish quotas. In other words, we need laws to limit the production of cotton, even fine, farmers, create fines, for example, punish those that are overproducing and so on. There was very harsh measures that they wanted to implement. Okay. This is not going to be supported. Again, those kinds of measures were seen too drastic, so there will be a widespread rejection again of those measures, by the way, across the board, all over Texas, because they were just too harsh, trying to dictate, in other words, what farmers needed to do and so on. So again, this is something that in the state of Texas, people are very, concerned about. Okay, how much the state can actually dictate, in other words, what you can do, how much you can produce, and so on. Okay. All right. So when President Roosevelt, FDR, comes into office in 1932, he is now implementing a New Deal, okay, in the United States, okay? So even though Texas is beginning to deal with the agricultural depression and unemployment in different ways, again, we just look at, for example, volunteerism and so on, like the cities providing certain, outlets for people to have some form of work or, shelter and the like, or, in agriculture, people trying to manage production. Well, when Roosevelt comes in, he's going to implement, again, a series of programs that in the state of Texas, again, we're going to see that those programs called the New Deal programs, the New Deal, were trying to really help the people of the United States, in this case, the peoples of Texas, getting some relief. It was so desperate. People in Texas were desperate for relief that it was required for them to actually receive some form of aid. For example, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This is the first New Deal agency that we're going to see, it's called the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. Relief, in other words, what people really wanted was relief, immediate relief. So what the New Deal is trying to do is get people's aid as soon as possible, in other words. Okay, so FDR is really departing in a very significant way from the path of Hoover, of non-intervention. Okay. Just one second here. Okay. All right. So instead of non-intervention, what FDR is saying, no, we need to intervene in the economy. We need to provide relief. This is just for the meantime, that is to say, something that is going to actually help Americans, or in this case, Texans, again, pretty much get by, something that they will enable them to survive. So this agency provided grants to the states and the municipalities for relief, to open up centers for housing, meals, and Medicare. Once again, so Texas received, through this program called the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, it received $80 million, in monies, again, for actually opening up centers for housing, to provide housing to people that have lost their houses, meals, 3 meals a day, and actually Medicare as well. Okay, it's called the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. All right, so that's first and foremost. Okay. Number two, he also implemented something called the Civil Works Administration. The Civil Works Administration was an agency of the New Deal introduced by FDR to hire, millions of Americans to do construction jobs for improving buildings and bridges, similar to what Texas was already doing in the cities, trying to create, certain city projects and so on to provide employment. Very, very similar, in which Texas is going to, through the Civil Works Administration, hire 239,264 Texans to do construction job, in this case to build roads and streets across Texas. So, this is very significant. Over 250,000 people, again, in Texas are going to now work for the state in construction jobs, if you will. Okay, we're going to see also the agricultural recovery, administration, the agricultural adjustment administration. So there is an agricultural depression in Texas taking place. Okay, so there is a real agricultural depression. The prices of crops have lost its value at least 50%, like cotton and other products. Again, so Texas farmers are really, again, in a predicament here in that they're very desperate, again, to receive some form of aid, some form of program or agency that will help this agricultural economy recover. And so again, FDR institutes what is called the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, to help farmers actually recover their economies, to help farmers, get back on their feet and now still, make money, in other words, because they're at this point out of business, so to speak. So agricultural recovery again. And so what the AAA is attempting to do is solve the problem of overproduction, by the way. In other words, there's so much products being produced, so much food being produced. That led to the Great Depression, the falling prices and so on. Okay, so what the AAA is going to do is do a market analysis every year to determine how much food actually is consumed, what is the demand, the actual real demand, again, of food products and so on, in the country, including exports as well. So what the AAA is attempting to do is actually trying to get farmers to produce just what is required in the market, to meet the demand and not to exceed it, in other words. Okay. So again, every year the AAA is supposed to now, tell the farmers, this is what you need to do. Okay. This is how much you need to grow. For example, how much cotton you need to grow, how much corn and wheat, and not to exceed, set quotas for production. Not only for farmers, but also for cattle ranchers, because cattle ranchers were also engaged in this mass production as well. This is mass production, again, of cattle. So what the AAA is trying to do is pretty much, kind of tell them, and not just tell them, but actually pay them. Okay, it's called subsidies. In other words, the AAA is going to send a check, if you will, so to speak, to farmers and cattle ranchers in Texas, not to exceed, how much cotton, corn, wheat, or cattle, in this case, they needed to produce. That's a subsidy. In other words, you get paid not to grow, in excess, in other words. Okay. The AAA in Texas, again, what it did is by 1940, farmers in Texas pretty much took 6 million acres out of this economy. In other words, that they were not really using now 6 million that they were previously using in the past to grow crops. They began to reduce the amount of land for agricultural production. Okay. 6 million acres. They're now saying we're not going to actually grow, more than we actually need. So what was previously used in the past, about 6 million acres, they're not using again. And they're receiving $3 billion again by 1940 in subsidies. In other words, they're getting paid not to grow more food. 3 billion, by 1940, again, in subsidies. Also, the AAA in Texas, created what is called the drought relief for Texas farmers. There's a drought, of course, and what the AAA is doing, providing relief, in people that are actually affected, that don't have any technology, that don't have any irrigation system to water their crops. The AAA is going to provide also what is called drought relief, monies, in other words, so they can actually stay in business. And the AAA is going to, in terms of animal farm and animal production, it actually bought 4 million cattle, sheep, and goats, again, in Texas to in many cases, again, to take out of circulation, so to speak, a good chunk of this, about 1.75 million animals were destroyed because there was just so many of them, in other words. So there were production of animals, so they bought the animals, and almost half of it, of course, were sacrificed, in other words, to kind of create this scarcity, if you will, to bring the prices up once again. And also that those that farmers that were affected by droughts that did not have technologies, the AAA provided electrification. It's called Rural Electrification Administration. It created also an agency to build electrical power lines again to rural dwellings. Again, there were really a lot of farmers that live in the countryside, have no access to electrical lines, and they're going to now provide, of course, electricity. This is something that happened in the Great Depression in the 1930s. Electricity is now reaching, again, farmers deep in the countryside. So through electricity, they can stay in business because they're going to have water pumps pumping water out of the ground, sprinkling their crops, and staying in business as well. Technology was actually required. 54,000 new customers were added again in Texas alone. Okay. In terms of industry, there's also, again, the New Deal is going to deal with what's called industrial recovery. Just like the AAA was helping farmers recover, the NRA, as it was called, the National Recovery Administration of 1933, was trying to do the same thing with industries to help the industries recover with the same thing. It's an agency that is going to do what is called national economic planning, doing a market analysis of all consumer goods in the country so industries can not exceed the quotas of what was actually the demand of products, clothing, shoes, anything that people were buying. Well, not to exceed, in other words, that industries need to stay within a certain range of production, not to affect their own prices. When the NRA was trying to maintain, to help really, industries recover by regulating industry and production, pretty much establishing production levels in order to fix prices, because if you overproduce and you exceed the demand, the prices of the products will come down, in other words, and industries will be affected. They will have to lay people off, you see, unemployment and the like. So again, the problem of overproduction, once again. And the NRA was also trying to grant concessions to unions, allowing people to form unions legally and bargain with their employers for better wages and better, working conditions and the like. So it also reached to the labor movement and trying to grant concessions, outline what's also child labor in the process as well. Okay, child labor. Minimum wages, maximum working hours, again, was part of the NRA. We need a national minimum wage, maximum working hours. We need to enforce those laws, again, nationwide. So the NRA in Texas, what it did is that it created what is called the Public Works Administration. Okay, the NRA, in order to actually hire millions of Texans in order to do, also construction work. This is what the NRA is also doing. Hiring Texans in order to build what is called, schools, colleges, campuses, parks, bridges, sewage plants, dams, etc. It actually gave Texas, again, $109 million for 922 public projects, thereby, of course, allowing the population to, have some form of employment, and they were trying to improve the infrastructure of the state and so on. There's also financial recovery in the financial sector. The New Deal also helped banks recover. Okay. In Texas, for example, we see a sharp decrease in banks. Many of them went bankrupt. They were previous to the Depression, there were 1,490 banks. And again, there are only 839 on the eve again, of the inauguration of FDR, when FDR comes into office in 1933. Again, it's a great reduction, again, of banks. Many of them are pretty much going bankrupt, closing altogether. So to revive the bank industry, what FDR is doing is actually passing what is called the Emergency Banking Act, in which is actually putting capital on banks to stay open. Okay, and that's first and foremost, because they're decapitalized, they're losing a lot of capital. Well, what the Emergency Banking Act is going to do is actually, put some money there in the banking system to stay open, and it's going to also provide insurance for customers. Those, if you have, of course, savings accounts in a bank, that in case the bank will have to close for some reason, that your savings are going to be insured up to $5,000. It's a $5,000 insurance. Again, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, again. So this is very important, that now people are going to grow confident that you have up to $5,000 again of insurance in your savings. So whatever happens to the bank, the government is going to back up at least $5,000 again on that deposit. And the Glass-Steagall Act is that it forbid banks from actually loaning money to people for investing it in the stock market. Okay, so you can no longer go to the bank, borrow money to invest it in the stock market. In other words, the Glass-Steagall Act, as it was called. Okay, and as a result of those, again, the deposits in Texas doubled. Again, people began to now go to the bank, and they start now to save once again, grow confident in the banking system because there's some form of insurance and that there's regulation. They're forbidding banks from actually issuing risky loans, in other words. So Texas deposits, again, in the banks doubled from 1925 to 1940. It doubled during this time. Now, there's also the issue of minorities. We talked about, again, the issue of minorities in the Great Depression, on the onset of the Great Depression with Herbert Hoover. Okay. Now, in the New Deal, when FDR comes into office, we're going to see women, for example, being hired in the New Deal agencies. Now, this is not to say that those were perfect agencies, but we see a change in that the minorities, slowly but surely, gradually are being addressed. In other words, that the New Deal agencies provide some form of relief, some form of employment to minorities like women. They were hired in the New Deal agencies to do different types of work, like cooking, for example, food processing, domestic service, healthcare, and so on. Those are activities that were needed, that the New Deal agencies hired women to do, and they were getting paid, by the way. Okay, that's first and foremost women. Okay, so this is big here. Also, African Americans were also addressed through the National Youth Administration, NYA, as it was called, hiring African Americans for part-time positions, teaching them vocational skills, offering college education, for example. Again, this is a type of a type of assistance that they receive. Mexican Americans also, just like African Americans, receive also, some form of assistance through the NYA, and in which they use those wages that they receive, again, from being employed in this agency as their only source of income. In many cases, that was the only source of income that they received during this time. Okay, Mexicans also joined unions for protection and survival. For example, it was very well known that Mexicans in Texas joined the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America for protection. In many cases, those unions actually offer assistance, employment, protection to them, and they had to resort on their own, again, forming unions, etc. Okay, so again, this is the end of our topic. We conclude this grand topic by saying that in the transition towards modernity, this industrial civilization that Texas is now on the road to, when Texas experienced economic and social hardships, the peoples of Texas formed grassroots organizations to help each other overcome the social, economic, and political ills through reform. That was the idea. Through reform, we can change the system in a way that their situation, their conditions can be improved. The actions of farmers, industrial workers, middle class progressives, and minorities help bring about reforms in the economic and political order of Texas. Okay, so this is something again that we covered in 3 sessions, and in this topic we're going to have only key terms. There's 3 key terms that will be in the final exam. The first one is in the first session, talk about populism, farmers and workers, again, and populism in Texas. The second key term is going to be Texas in the progressive era. Okay, we cover that in session 2. And in this session, Texas in the Great Depression. Okay, so this is all I have for you. And then I'll see you in the 9th topic, the final topic of the semester, again, that is coming next after this topic. Again, so it's Texas in the age of globalization. Okay, we initiate a whole new topic after this, okay, in session 1 of the 9th topic. That's all I have for you, and I'll see you then in the next topic. Thank you.